A happy humanitarian and social justice and human rights Valentine's Day to all of you, our listeners, this 14th day of February 2012. On behalf of Education for Peace and Dignity, we have another Dignity Report. My name is Dr. W. Randy Short. Today we will be interviewing Mr. RICARDO JONES. He is a former Senior Investigator of the EEOC for the New York Division District Office. For 10 years he served in that capacity. He has an incredible report to share with us. The extent to which the EEOC is an agency that systematically refuses to provide equal protection under law for persons of color. Much of what Mr. Jones will share with us today will be both shocking and alarming to many of you. On behalf of Dignity and Education for Peace, we give this disclaimer, which is rare, that his opinions, be they right or wrong or righteous or inflammatory, are solely his. However, we believe with a free press and with the access of the internet, all opinions, in particular for those persons who stand for justice, whether we know all the facts or not, are valid. So we thank him for coming. We also want to recognize the person who made this possible, the First Lady of African American, and Pan-African struggle, the Honorable Cynthia McKinney, the first woman in history to be selected as a candidate to run for a major party for President of the United States. We also want to bring to your attention that Mr. RICARDO JONES, Sr., albeit someone who has a very strong voice to criticize the government, is a retired veteran, attaining the rank of Master Sergeant with many, many declarations, among these the Bronze Star. Without further ado, I would like to have Mr. Jones share with us a summary of what it is he'd like to share with us and his case with the EEOC. Welcome, Mr. Jones.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here today to get the opportunity to expose the fraud and corruption that's going on at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission nationwide. And I'd like to recognize the people, Cynthia McKinney and others, to include our moderator, who has given me the opportunity to speak out on the injustices that are being perpetrated against black people in our community. And I tell you, there is a very conspiratorial fraud being perpetrated against black people in this community by the EEOC, the managers of the EEOC, and also the Senate committee that oversees the EEOC. So there are many people that are making money off of the pain and the suffering of black people who are just trying to earn a decent living for their families and themselves and to work in a hostile-free work environment. But the EEOC, which has been mandated to protect the rights of African Americans and foreign-born blacks, are basically targeting foreign-born blacks. Any discrimination case filed by an African American or a foreign-born black are dismissed summarily by the EEOC just based on the color of the complainants that filed race discrimination at the EEOC. Many African Americans and many foreign-born blacks have stopped filing race complaints at the EEOC because they have knowledge that if you say your discriminatory basis is based on race, your complaint will be dismissed. Now, how the EEOC dismisses complaints of discrimination is they have a system, and it's like an A, B, C system. An A complaint is a complaint that is possibly going to be litigated by the lawyers at the EEOC. A B complaint is a complaint that has less evidence for litigation, but will possibly be mediated by the mediators at the EEOC. And the mediation process, which is called the ADR process, which is Alternative Dispute Resolution, is basically giving employers who have conducted discriminatory practices against their employees a free pass. Basically, it is negotiated at a low level, and the complaints are lowballed, and then the discriminatory employers get like a get-out-of-jail-free card right, by making the complaint basically go away. So many employers that had participated in the discriminatory practices against African Americans and foreign-born blacks signed what they call a mediation agreement with the EEOC. And basically what that is it gives the employer the ability to be brought up on charges of discrimination, but not totally held accountable. And they can get certain general releases that they would not be able to get during the regular investigative process. So the system at the EEOC has been set up basically to discriminate against black people. White people can file a complaint at the EEOC and they will be treated much better than black people. Hispanics and Asians will be treated much better than the black people. I'm going to give you a prime example of that. In the New York District Office of the EEOC, which services everything north of Trenton, New Jersey, all the way up to the tip top of Maine, and everything from Connecticut all the way out to western New York to Buffalo, there is only one black attorney for that whole area. There are about 3 million foreign-born blacks and African Americans in the New York 5 boroughs alone, not counting upstate, Long Island, or Westchester County. It's 3 million. And in that area with 3 million African Americans and foreign-born blacks, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, one of the highest civil rights agencies in the land, only has one black trial attorney, one in New York City and one in Boston. Now, that fact alone tells you basically what kind of attention they're willing to pay to race discrimination in the largest black community in the country. There are more Asian lawyers in the New York District Office than there are black lawyers in the New York District area. Now, there's something wrong with that. If there's only one black attorney in the New York District Office, and there's only one black attorney in the Boston District Office, and there's possibly 5 to 10 million foreign-born blacks and African Americans in between that area, and that's a low number, then how in the world are they going to service all the complaints filed by African Americans and foreign-born blacks? They don't intend to. So what they do is they summarily make all African American complaints and foreign-born black complaints C charges. And a C charge is a charge that has been identified for dismissal. So that means you walk into the door of an EEOC office and you're African American or foreign-born black, they automatically make your charge a C charge, meaning that your charge will not be investigated, it will be dismissed, and you will be issued a right to sue. Now, the problem is most African Americans and foreign-born blacks do not have the ability to take a complaint that has been dismissed by the EEOC and exercise that right to sue, which they only have 90 days to do so. So if you go to the EEOC to file a complaint of discrimination, the first thing they do is inform your employer. And then the first thing your employer does is retaliates against you and fires you. The EEOC does not go out and seek an injunction to stop the firing or your wrongful termination. They just basically say, well, we're going to dismiss your complaint, even though the retaliation is crystal clear, right? We're going to issue you a dismissed complaint based on your color, black, and give you a right to sue and send you to federal court. Now, your chances of surviving in federal court filing a lawsuit pro se are a snowball's chance in hell. So instead of the EEOC's enforcing the civil rights laws of 1964 that many people fought and died for, that were hung, lynched, raped, beat, where many people thought that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was going to be effective, the current administration has basically helped to undermine the civil rights laws in this country. Now, the current administration is doing the socially safe thing to do because they are enforcing gay rights, lesbian rights, and other forms of discrimination to include disability discrimination. But they have underplayed and they have dismissed all complaints of race discrimination for African Americans and foreign-born blacks. Now, that's not RICARDO JONES saying this. If you go to the EEOC website, which is EEOC.gov, you will see that the success rate for the so-called investigation of African American and foreign-born black race complaints is about 3.5%. Now, what that means is that 96.5% of the rest of the complaints have been dismissed. Now let me make that a little simpler for you. If there's 100 complaints filed by African Americans and foreign-born blacks, that means 3.5 and one-half people will get a cause finding that will lead to some type of resolution of their race complaints. But the real issue is 96.5%, or 96 African Americans and a half, 0.5, will get a dismissal notice, meaning that they could not find any form of race discrimination for 96 and a half African Americans or foreign-born blacks. Now, those statistics alone will tell you, right, that there is something wrong at the EEOC.
Mr. Jones, thank you very much for that summary of the EEOC. I happened to see online people described the EEOC as excusing excesses on coloreds instead of the equal opportunity group. That's interesting. That sounds like maybe someone knew you that put that there. But I wanted to ask you some questions, but before I even get into your background that brings you here, that journey that got you to the point of being in that office from April 2001 to April 2010, I wanted to ask you a little bit about this organization that's called the Coalition for Change. What is the Coalition for Change?
The Coalition for Change is a nonprofit organization that was founded by Ms. Tanya Jordan, and the president is Mr. Philip Taylor. And it's an organization, it's basically a support group for former African Americans and foreign-born blacks that worked in the federal government that were discriminated against for basically on their race. And what they've done is they've formed a support group and a foundation, the Coalition for Change, to support individuals who are trying to deal with the emotional fallout from being discriminated against at federal government employment.
Excuse me. So this organization, the Coalition for Change, and they have a website which is www.coalition4change.org. This group was brought together because there is a problem with discrimination in the federal government.
That is correct. There is a major problem of discrimination by the largest employer in this country. Many people don't know that the federal government is the largest employer in the United States of America. But what is going on is, because the economic situation in the country is so bad that many of the African Americans who have raised up through the government ranks, their positions are not needed to be filled by non-African Americans. Basically, whites need the positions that we blacks have attained in the federal government. So there's a systematic approach to get rid of African Americans and foreign-born blacks in the federal government, and they're doing that even though the administration has a face of color. It hasn't changed the fact that they need to eliminate African Americans and foreign-born blacks from the federal government registry.
I have a compound question. The first part of my question is, you're saying that the Obama administration, the first black president, that there appears to be a continuation of discrimination against people of color, black Americans in particular, that would mirror whatever was happening, if not is worse than what existed under the Bush administration, is part one. And then part two, my question, since you worked at the EEOC, it is my understanding that the best civil rights attorneys, about a third of the best attorneys, were purged under the Bush administration. And my question is, did the new head of the Justice Department, Mr. Eric Holder, whose boss is ultimately Mr. Obama, did they replace the people who had been purged by Bush with people who would stand up for racial and social justice, which is the charter of the EEOC?
Okay, let me address this question this way. I started at the EEOC in April 2001, which was under the Bush administration, and my tenure lasted to April the 1st, April Fool's Day 2010. And they intentionally fired me on April Fool's Day to make the point that maybe I may be a fool for standing up for the rule of law for all people, not just African Americans, right? I'm going to address your questions this way. The Obama administration, we had great hopes because under the Bush administration, everybody understood that the EEOC basically was doing preventive work. Basically, they weren't enforcing vigorously the discrimination laws. Basically, they were going out and doing trainings to teach bad employers how to be good employers. Well, we understood that because we knew that the Bush administration were pro big business and corporations. But the hope was when Obama's administration or transition team was to take over, that there would be a shift and we would go back to enforcing civil rights laws, because basically for the 8 years of the Bush administration, we basically did damage control. We did not really aggressively enforce the civil rights laws of 1964. But the corrupt managers at the EEOC and the corrupt lawyers at the EEOC, and you cannot become a lawyer at the EEOC unless you are connected to somebody. So the bad lawyers at the EEOC and the corrupt lawyers at the EEOC bring in other corrupt lawyers. So the issues that came about were that the expectations for naive people like RICARDO Jones is that we would get aggressive and enforce civil rights laws once the Obama administration took over. The insiders, the managers, and the directors, and the corrupt lawyers, and the career civil servants at the EEOC knew that the Obama administration was friendly towards bad employers and bad federal agencies. So what happened was when the Obama administration took over and when Jacqueline Barron's transition team came into the EEOC, the word had already been out that they were friendly to employers and federal agencies that discriminated against their employees. And they sped up their illegal activities. They sped up the bribery and the frauds. They sped up fixing cases for people that they knew. They sped up fixing cases for politicians, because politicians do call into the EEOC and they have investigations stopped that are going on in their districts. Also, corporate executives call to the EEOC, and PACs call into the EEOC to speak to their contacts at the EEOC headquarters to have certain investigations stopped or to find something wrong with investigations so that their buddies and their friends and the corporations that are friendly to the PACs won't be investigated at the EEOC.
I have another question, and it's compound again, and these are short. Given that experience that you had, that the EEOC seems to have been either the same or worse under the current administration of Barack Hussein Obama, would you vote for him to get a second term? There are many African Americans in particular who are saying he needs another chance to make things right. Do you believe that there will be a difference if Mr. Obama is given a second chance to be president?
I'm going to be very honest. I was very naive myself in voting for President Obama. I had gotten emails back to 2002. Of course, I was in the World Trade Center. The office of the EEOC was in 7 World Trade Center. And I was there the day that the planes went through Building 1 and Building 2. And we were very fortunate that all the employees at the EEOC got out without anybody being lost or harmed. We were very fortunate to survive that incident. Immediately after that, I started receiving emails about Barack Obama, senator from Illinois. I didn't know who he was because of his name, Barack Hussein Obama. It just didn't strike a bell to me. So for the next 2 years, I didn't know who this individual was. And then until they had the Democratic Convention in 2004, when Senator Kerry from Massachusetts introduced Barack Hussein Obama, and he gave that great speech about we're all Americans and we're Americans before anything else, and we need to come together as Americans, and and many people recognized Mr. Obama at that time as a unifying factor. I thought he may be a unifying factor. I also knew that he had a relationship with the Reverend Jeremiah Wright. And I also knew that he had a relationship with Oprah Winfrey. So I thought that he had been exposed. I thought that he really knew more about what it was to be a black person in America and the suffering that went on with black people in America. I also did not know that he was a former employment lawyer for Sibley and Austin out of Chicago, where he met his wife, who was a former employment lawyer out of Sibley and Austin out of Chicago. I believe that he was supervised by his wife at Sibley and Austin, and they became engaged, and eventually they became married. Right?
So in the final analysis, you would or would not vote for the current president in relationship to him being an agent for change vis-a-vis President Bush?
I don't see any change that President Obama has brought to the EEOC or civil rights issues in this country. I think that he is a repressive individual that is attempting to undermine the civil rights laws of this country. I think that he is a panderer to any group that he feels that can benefit himself. The socially acceptable thing to do today as far as civil rights is to enforce gay and lesbian rights. Now, there are many other problems in this country other than gay and lesbian rights. I will admit that gay and lesbian rights are one of the issues that should be enforced today, but they're just one. The crux of the real problem in this country, and it has always been, is race discrimination. Until we are allowed to get past race discrimination, this country will never be able to go forward. That is the fundamental problem that we're having in this country. And President Obama does not seem to want to address that issue. He seems to want to table that issue every opportunity that he has. All of his civil rights legislation in his first term in office have been guided towards gays and lesbians. He also signed an executive order for a white woman out of the South by the name of Lilly Ledbetter. Lilly Ledbetter is a legislation that affects the Equal Pay Act. But that Equal Pay Act is being modified by an executive order to benefit a white Southern woman. If that woman had been Josephine Brown, he wouldn't have signed that executive order for Josephine Brown. But for Lilly Ledbetter, a white woman from the South, he signs an executive order. So the truth of the matter is, I would not vote for President Obama based on his past practices as far as race discrimination for black people in America.
I have another question. This can be answered quickly if you would indulge me. My understanding is roughly, and it may be higher given the fall of the number of blacks employed, but a minimum of 50% of African Americans that are in the middle class are public or government sector employees. Given that, if there's no protection for these persons, what is the future of those blacks, that large number of blacks who are making good salaries with benefits? If the EEOC doesn't serve them and there's a pressure for those jobs, what's their future like?
Well, I'm going to be honest with you. There is no future for African Americans or foreign-born blacks in federal government, civil service jobs, state government, or local government. If we still think that we have a security blanket in those jobs, then we're fooling ourselves. They're systematically eliminating us from those positions. And the EEOC, which has authority over what we call the Fair Employment Agencies, the FEPAs, that's the local, state, county fair employment agencies, basically are in cahoots with the bad employers of this country. There's an impression under the Obama administration that if you allow the bad employers and bad corporations to have a free hand to discriminate against blacks and African Americans, they will create more jobs. And as I've said before, as my West Indian grandmother says, if there's a hole in the bottom of the pot, no matter how many jobs you put in the top of the pot, all the jobs are going to go out the bottom in the hole. So I don't know if Mr. Obama and his administration understand that. Now, they can tote out all the numbers of the jobs they have created, but it doesn't matter how many jobs you create if you're not enforcing employment discrimination laws. So that means no matter how many jobs you get, that means that the employers are going to discriminate based on race. Now, they feel that is a business necessity to do that, and it benefits their businesses to discriminate against African Americans and foreign-born blacks and then bring in another group of individuals to take their places. So the foreign-born blacks and African Americans have to work twice as hard. They got to go along with twice as much bad employment practices and discriminatory employment practices and non-promotions than any other group of people in this country. And the Obama administration, and I'm quite sure Mr. Obama, being a Harvard law professor, being an individual that practiced employment law at Slibby and Austin, understands this very well. But basically, he's given bad employers and bad government agencies and bad local governments the ability to discriminate against African Americans with nothing that will be held against them by the federal EEOC that oversees all employment discrimination. So the EEOC is basically a corrupt paymaster of all attorneys. Most attorneys in this country know that the EEOC is nothing more than a warehouse to right to sue. And basically they know the EEOC is corrupt. They're taking money, they're taking bribes, they're taking positions with major law firms, right? They're looking out for their jobs after they leave the EEOC. So what is going on is there's a systematic plan to discriminate against black people and African Americans and foreign-born blacks at the federal level of the EEOC. Many black politicians know this, many white politicians know this, but it's a well-kept secret that is allowed to continue on because it makes large amounts of money for attorneys, judges, lawyers, process servers. The statistics alone expose the EEOC for the frauds and the corrupt individuals that they are, not Ricardo Jones. Their own statistics show that there is something fundamentally wrong with the enforcement efforts of the EEOC.
Could you cite a website where they could find this information?
Yes, I can. You can go to the EEOC's website, which is www.eeoc.gov. That's www.eeoc.gov, and go to statistics. And then look at the statistics of the cases that have been dismissed by the EEOC. Now, the EEOC has a little secret way of getting around that. They consider a dismissal a resolution. Now, we all know that a dismissal of a race complaint is not a resolution. A dismissal is a dismissal. And if you go into federal court with a case that's been dismissed by the EEOC, you basically have less than a snowball's chance in hell of winning your case at the federal level in federal district court.
Thank you. Now, we may come back to this. It's always helpful when you bring volatile, inflammatory, revelatory information to an audience that people be able to know that you're a human being, not just a person who has what some might consider vitriol or what would we say, a disgruntled employee or other sorts of terms that are going to be tossed your direction. Tell us, who is Ricardo Jones Sr.? If you could take a minute or two to bring us through your life, some of the things that shaped you, and we can return to that. But it's always helpful. I always like for the people I interview to show that they're people, they breathe, they have children, they have wives, they have homes. Could you do that for me?
Sure. I want to tell you a little bit about Ricardo Jones, but let me tell you a little bit first about, my qualifications, right? And how I became an investigator at the EEOC. Well, my career in law enforcement and investigation started when I joined the United States Army. And I joined the United States Army from Washington, D.C., where I grew up in southeast Washington, D.C. I lived in the projects on 58th Street in northeast Washington, D.C.
Simple City. Yeah.
I lived in the projects in southeast Washington, D.C. in a place called Simple City, in between Simple City and another housing projects by the name of Eastgate. I lived on F Street and Benning Road, and I went to school in Washington, D.C. and in Maryland at Crossland and at Howard D. Woodson High School in Washington, D.C. But in 1974, I was forced to join the United States Army, and I went in as a military policeman. And I became a very distinguished military policeman. I graduated on the Commandant's list from the United States Army Military Police School in Fort Gordon, Georgia. And from there, I was assigned to Fort Hood, Texas as a line-duty military policeman. After a year of being a military policeman, I was selected based on my successful performance to be a federal investigator, military police investigator, and I was sent back to Fort McClellan, Alabama, where the military police school was reassigned to go through the military police investigations course at 19 years old. And I successfully completed that course, and I went back to Fort Hood, Texas, and I became an undercover plainclothes military police investigator. I was there for a year, and then from there I was reassigned to the Republic of Panama, where I was a military policeman and a military police investigator. And from there I was assigned to Walter Reed Army Medical Center, Washington, D.C., where I was a military police investigator. During that time, I became the personal bodyguard to Martin Luther King Sr., which is everybody's well known as Daddy King. Daddy King's wife was killed in Atlanta, Georgia, by a deranged woman in the church that they had there.
On their third child's birthday.
Which is very tragic. But I want everybody to know how courageous the King family is. Daddy King, after his wife was killed on his third child's birthday, grandchild's birthday, right, came to Walter Reed Army Medical Center by himself. This was a gentleman who was well in his late 70s. He got on an airplane in a wheelchair, and he was wheeled off the airplane with no personal bodyguards. He was not afraid. And I met him with two other individuals, right? We wheeled him off the plane, and this was a very elderly man who was balding on the top and had gray hair on his sides. And he was very basically withdrawn. He didn't say much at all. We wheeled him into a car, and we drove him to Walter Reed. And basically, when he got out at Walter Reed to give a speech on behalf of the Black Historical Association of Washington, D.C., he unfolded into an individual that I didn't recognize. He became a lion. And when he got on the podium, he roared like a lion. And that's when I realized where Martin Luther King Jr. got his oratory skills from. He got it from his father. And his father gave a speech that was so dramatic and so strong, I couldn't believe a gentleman of his age could give a speech like that. At the end of his speech, he does basically the song, "We Shall Overcome." But because I was the only black investigator there, they said, "Ricardo, you know his wife was killed in the church in Atlanta, Georgia. So we want you to hold the Bible, put your arm around Daddy King. And if anybody comes up and tries to shoot Daddy King, you should step in front of them and take this bullet." I was 22 years old. Do you know what goes through the mind of a 22-year-old when they tell you to step in front of a person who's trying to kill a 70-year-old? I first said to myself that I'm 22, and this man is 70-some years old. My first thought is to preserve myself versus preserving him. But the reality was, what I did do is I took my pistol out, put it in my pocket, and I held the Bible, and I said to myself that push comes to shove, if somebody tries to shoot Daddy King, then I'm going to shoot them before they shoot Daddy King. And then at the last resort, I will step in front of Daddy King at that point. So that basically brought me into the civil rights arena as Daddy King's personal bodyguard. After that, I was sent to the Drug Enforcement Academy's 2-week course. So I had been trained in drug enforcement by the Department of Justice, and I had went through various other investigation courses by the Department of Army and also by the Prince George's County Police Department. And I continued my career in the United States Army as an Army recruiter in New York City and a career counselor, and I retired from the United States Army.
At the rank of a Master Sergeant.
Yes, I retired at the rank of a Master Sergeant. I'm a decorated combat veteran. I served a 6-month tour in Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Kuwait. I was on the front lines. I was on the Euphrates River. I was on the Tigris River. I was stationed north of Kuwait City near the town of Ali Basra. So I wasn't down at the port. I wasn't in the rear area. I was in the front line areas. I was assigned to the 1st Infantry Division, which is known as the Big Red One.
And having given your background prior to going to the EEOC, you grew up in Washington, D.C., you went into the military, you finished the military. What got you to the EEOC, if you could share that?
Well, I retired from the United States Army at Fort Hood, Texas, and I had a career after the military. I was a job placement specialist at the largest Job Corps training center in North Texas and McKinney, Texas. I worked as a counselor for children that were at risk at a organization called the Williams House. And I also worked as a postman in North Dallas, and I also worked as a veterans coordinator for a Hispanic organization which is called the National Veterans Outreach Program. But while I was in Dallas, right, the position became available for a civilian reserve recruiter in Staten Island, New York. And I applied for that position, and I accepted that position. I went to Staten Island, New York. I became the top civilian reserve recruiter for the country. The Army Reserves were having a hard time fulfilling their recruitment mission, and since I was a former college recruiter for the United States Army in New York City, they felt that I could help them attain their reserve objective. During that time, I was discriminated against by a Hispanic clique that had been formed at Fort Hamilton, New York. I attempted to file a complaint against the Hispanic clique, which was mainly non-commissioned officers and white officers and white Hispanic officers. Basically were helping Hispanics to succeed, and they didn't like the fact that an African American had came in there and outperformed them in the New York area. So they wanted me out of there. So they didn't like the fact that I was better than they were, and they did everything in their power to engineer me out of that position. I was eventually forced out, and I had to leave the government contractor, which was named MPRI. And I filed a complaint against MPRI, and then I found out how corrupt the EEOC actually is. There's a gentleman who was a federal investigator at the EEOC by the name of Clyde Lochin, who knew a friend of mine. My friend knew I had a background in investigations in the United States Army, and I had done some equal opportunity work in the United States Army in Korea. So what he did was set up some training sessions, basically that was set up to bring us on as investigators at the EEOC. I went to the training sessions that were set up by Mr. Clyde Lochin, where we did role play, and I honestly didn't believe I'd get into the federal government this way, but I went through the motions. So we went through the role play, and then I went to the EEOC at 7 World Trade Center, and I had an interview by a lady by the name of Nancy Boyd, who was an enforcement manager at the EEOC, and a guy by the name of William Lai. And I still didn't believe I'd get hired, even though I was well qualified. I had a background in investigations and in equal opportunity in the United States Army. And I did get hired. Lo and behold, they hired me. But the reason why they hired me was they basically had encouraged Clyde Lochin, who was a corrupt investigator who had taken bribes while at the EEOC, to go recruit other blacks who would be exactly like him, that would take bribes and would do what he was told. So I didn't know that in the beginning. We were involved in a very major investigation of Ralph Lauren Polo, the famous designer that we buy clothes from and is well known. And this investigation was a very, very large investigation because Ralph Lauren Polo had been accused of discriminating against African Americans and foreign-born blacks. It was known that he did not like African Americans or foreign-born blacks and wanted them into the back office. This investigation was done statistically by Clyde Lochin. The statistics bared out the discriminatory practices of Ralph Lauren Polo. At that time, there was a decision being made whether to litigate. That means the EEOC will take Ralph Lauren Polo to federal court on behalf of African Americans and foreign-born blacks in a class action lawsuit. Well, the decision was made somewhere that we should try to do a negotiated settlement agreement with Ralph Lauren Polo. This was set up, and the law firm that represented Ralph Lauren Polo was the law firm of Proskauer and Rose. Proskauer and Rose set up a negotiated settlement agreement with Mr. Clyde Lochin. I had only been an investigator at the EEOC for 6 months, and Clyde Lochin came to me and said, "Ricardo, I'm going to a settlement negotiations with Ralph Lauren Polo at Proskauer and Rose's office in Manhattan." I believe it was in the Empire State Building. I'm not sure. And he said, "Would you go to me?" And I was just new at the EEOC. So I said, "Sure, I'll go with you." So Clyde Lochin and Ricardo Jones went to this settlement conference with Ralph Lauren Polo and at least 10 lawyers for Proskauer and Rose. And we got there. The EEOC sent no lawyers with us. So 2 non-lawyers, one junior investigator and 1 senior investigator went to negotiate a class action investigation of discrimination against Ralph Lauren Polo, which I thought was strange. So we're in this big room with Ralph Lauren Polo's representatives and at least 10 lawyers from Proskauer and Rose. And as soon as we got into the room, I saw these plans of a cancer research clinic on the wall where we were doing negotiations at. And what the lead attorney, his name is Paul Salvatore, he now works at Proskauer and Rose in Washington, D.C., said that Ricardo and Clyde Lochin, we just want to let you know before we get started, we're breaking ground this week in a cancer research clinic in Harlem Hospital. So basically they told it out there, the fact that they're going to have a cancer research clinic built in Harlem Hospital for black people because Ralph Lauren Polo has been basically confirmed of discriminating against African-American foreign-born blacks. Now, that was very impressive to me. My mother died of cancer. My aunt died of cancer. Many people in my family have been affected by cancer. So I'm saying, wow, that blew me away. I never knew things like that went on. Basically, he said we hired a bunch of black consultants, and we've given a large amount of money to these black consultants. We hired a black EEO manager that has the power to hire, fire, and promote, and we're serious about correcting the discriminatory practices at Ralph Lauren Polo. I thought this was fantastic, and I said, hey, you guys are the poster children for reform. Little did I know how that really was taken by Ralph Lauren Polo and Proskauer and Rose, and especially by Paul Salvatore, the lead attorney for Ralph Lauren Polo. The next 6 weeks after that, I received a call from Paul Salvatore, and he said, Ricardo Jones, do you remember me from the negotiations at Ralph Lauren Polo? I said, yes, I do. He says, you have a case against this company by the name MB&A, which was an investment banker and insurance company in New York. And I'm representing MB&A, and we want to settle that case. Ricardo, I wonder if you can set up some type of settlement negotiations like we did with Ralph Lauren Polo. I'm less than 6 months at the EEOC, and I'm saying, hey, great, I get the opportunity to maybe negotiate a large settlement with a major law firm and an employment banking insurance company at the EEOC. Well, what he wanted was a fixed deal like he got for Ralph Lauren Polo, because the truth of the matter was the discriminatory practices of Ralph Lauren Polo were so bad that that case should have never been negotiated in the first place. It should have been taken directly to federal court, and the EEOC lawyers should have litigated that in federal court and eventually got a consent decree or got a finding against Ralph Lauren Polo. But because the fix was in with my friend who got me to the EEOC, which was Clyde Lochin, and one of the complainants, and it must have been 30 or 40 complainants against Ralph Lauren Polo that were African American and foreign-born blacks. One of the complainants' sister was an attorney who was representing the complainants, some of the complainants against Ralph Lauren Polo. So the deal was settle this thing and get a settlement and don't go to federal court. But on behalf of the people in the community and the complainants, the EEOC should have litigated against Ralph Lauren Polo, and they didn't. So the fix was in from the very beginning. But the tragic thing to this whole thing was my buddy Clyde Lochin, who brought me to the EEOC, told me that he took $5,000 from Paul Salvatore, the attorney for Ralph Lauren Polo, and that $5,000 was given to his Steel Drum Club. He was a Trinidadian black investigator at the EEOC, and his son was in a Steel Drum Club. So basically, he went to Paul Salvatore, the lawyer for Proskauer and Rose and for Ralph Lauren Polo, and took a bribe for $5,000 to his Steel Drum Club where his son was in. And the reason why I believe that he told me that is to condition me to say that, Ricardo, you can get money also. But because of the ethics I learned as a federal investigator in the United States Army and a military policeman, the first thing they taught us was never talk about a bribe, never take anything from anybody, because once you sell yourself to somebody, then you're bought and paid for, and you never can get your honor and your ethics back once you take a bribe. So,
how commonplace would you say bribe taking was by whoever, judges, lawyers, EEOC employees? Was that commonplace? Would you say that happened on a regular basis, or was Mr. Lochin an exception to the rule?
At first I thought it may be an exception to the rule. I had been there less than a year, and a bribe had been paid to the person that brought me into the EEOC. But over the next 8 to 9 years in my tenure at the EEOC, I found that was a common practice that went on at the EEOC. And Clyde Lochin didn't invent that himself. He found out that these cases have been fixed at the lawyer level, at the director level, that many things that were illegal were going on at the EEOC. I found out in an investigation, some other investigations that I had conducted, that there was a senior lawyer at the EEOC who was taking bribes. His name was Lou Graziano. And Lou Graziano was an attorney that came over from the Department of Labor. Many attorneys transferred from the Department of Labor to the EEOC way back when. And Lou was one of those who was a Department of Labor, basically a age discrimination lawyer, that when they transferred the ADEA, which is the Age Discrimination Act, from the Department of Labor to the EEOC, he came over with that group. And he was on the take. And he was taking bribes, and he was fixing cases for his friends, and he worked with the Assistant General Counsel of the EEOC, which is a gentleman by the name of James Lee, who is a sexual predator. Most of the female attorneys at the EEOC and some of the female workers, administrative workers at the EEOC, have been sexually harassed by the Assistant General Counsel for the EEOC, James Lee. Now, the only reason why I know this is that those females had came to me and told me this because they were afraid to go public or to complain against James Lee.
So the same agency that's supposed to protect protected classes, the people, women, minorities, you're saying that there is systematic, system-wide exploitation of women within the very agency that's supposed to look out for the rights of women nationally. Am I understanding that correctly, at least in that office, that women had no real recourse to avoid this?
Well, prior to me getting to the EEOC and after I had been there, I heard there was very promiscuous sexual situations going on between the managers, the attorneys, and the employees at the EEOC.
Exclusively heterosexual, or do they have the other kinds as well?
They were having some serious sexual issues going on because they have a large number of homosexual attorneys at the EEOC. So it was going on both ways, whether it's homosexually or heterosexually. There was a lot of sexual harassment and sexual compromising and sexual improprieties going on at the EEOC, so much that they couldn't really conduct the investigations that they weren't doing.
Did you ever have any situation where that happened to you?
No, I never had anybody confront me with a overt sexual offer. I mean, if there was some type of request to go out or do anything that was basically off duty or whatever, and then that was it. But I've heard that Mr. James Lee, the Assistant General Counsel of the EEOC, would force other attorneys and force other administrative workers and other investigators to have sex with him so that they can move up. Now, I can only know this as a male if a female came to me and told me this information. And the only reason why they came to me is because they knew I wasn't on the tape, I wouldn't compromise myself, I conducted all investigations by the rule of law, and many investigators at the EEOC do not conduct investigations by the rule of law. Many of the investigators at the EEOC are not qualified to be there. They have a habit of hiring interns that have only been trained to dismiss cases and then hiring them as investigators. I don't know how you can take an intern out of college that probably never had a job or had very few jobs and then make them a federal investigator to investigate discrimination in the workplace when they do not have any employment experience, no background on investigations or law enforcement, and then have them do nothing but dismiss complaints at the EEOC.
Amid your career, your 10-year career, did you receive declarations or good job reviews or evaluations as an uncorruptible employee, as a senior investigator for the New York District Office? Did you get citations? Did you rise up to some degree in your job status?
I think based on my background and my experience, I probably was the top federal investigator in the whole country for the EEOC. I had more successful litigations than anybody else in my office. I brought in more money than probably anybody else in my office in settlements and successful litigations. It's one thing to have a successful investigation that finds cause, and I found cause probably more than anybody in my office, which caused a problem because they were only used to dismissing complaints. I refused to dismiss claims against African Americans and foreign-born blacks. The other black investigators in my office basically dismissed every case that they basically had because they had not been trained to know how to expose discrimination in the workplace anyway. But based on my experience in the military and my experience at the DEA and my experience in life, right, I knew how to talk to people and interview people and bring out information that most of the other investigators in my office could not do. But there was a systemic problem and there was a conspiracy in my office to dismiss all African American and foreign-born blacks. We would have meetings of the black investigators and they would say, Ricardo, you know you're rocking the boat by doing such a good job on these black complaints. Why don't you just dismiss them like the rest of us? They're just widgets. You don't know these people. Just dismiss the complaints and move them off your desk. I said, they're people just like us.
So these are professional blacks who have made it, who are saying, allow discrimination to happen against fellow African Americans as long as they receive their checks.
I would not call them professional. I would call them amateurs. And basically, they were yes people, and basically, they were Aunt Jemimas and Uncle Toms that basically just wanted to keep their checks. And they knew that the manager and the district director, Spencer Lewis, who basically wanted all complaints against African Americans and foreign-born blacks dismissed. But this went further than the district level. It went all the way up to Washington, D.C. Again, if you go to www.eeoc.gov and look at their statistics. Now, remember what I'm saying, that the EEOC considers a dismissal a resolution. Now, I don't know how a dismissal can be a resolution. A dismissal is a dismissal. So their statistics basically tell on themselves. But I have received awards from the Republican Attorney General of the United States in 2008 on Ellis Island for successful litigations against not Ralph Lauren Polo, but for Tavern on the Green, the largest restaurant chain in New York City, and Adelphi University and Fox News Network. And that's just a few of the successful investigations that I did and the settlements that I did. I think that I made a lot of waves against some people that had influence at the EEOC, especially Proskauer and Rose, who basically had an inside track at the EEOC by paying off Clyde Lochin and others at the EEOC. Also, the vice chair of the EEOC, her name is Leslie Silverman. She fixed cases for Proskauer and Rose while she was a commissioner and vice chair of the EEOC. She also worked on the Senate committee that oversaw the EEOC. When she left the EEOC after 6 years, you wouldn't believe which law firm she went to work for as a partner. She went to work for Proskauer and Rose in Washington, D.C., where she had been in 6 years and had been fixing cases for Proskauer and Rose. Now, the irony to this whole story is, guess what top negotiator that went to work with Leslie Silverman, the vice chair of the EEOC, when she went to work as a partner? And most lawyers don't start out in law firms as partners. She was hired as a partner. But she went to work with Paul Salvatore, the guy that bribed my buddy Clyde Lochin. Now, why would they move the guy that bribed the guy who brought me into the EEOC from New York City to Washington, D.C. and put them with Leslie Silverman? So Leslie Silverman's influence over the EEOC for Proskauer and Rose is now going to be teamed up with Paul Salvatore, who bribed the federal investigator for Ralph Lauren Polo. So what do you think their intent is to? They're going to use their influence to still fix cases for Proskauer and Rose in the Washington, D.C. area, right, against the public. Now, this is not a secret. This is a well-known fact. And I dare anybody to confront Proskauer and Rose and deny the fact that Paul Salvatore didn't bribe Clyde Lochin, who is now a mediator in Tampa, Florida. This is a fact. This has never been denied. And Leslie Silverman had made it known to Nancy Boyd, the deputy director of the EEOC in New York City, to find something wrong with the investigation of the NBA and the Dallas Mavericks that were conducted by Ricardo Jones. And they basically, Nancy Boyd basically got the call from Leslie Silverman to find something wrong because they did not want that case to be litigated.
Is that the start of where you began to have a problem with the EEOC? Bring us to the point where You had rocked the boat, you had crusaded, you had not been compromised, you would not take bribes. What resulted ultimately, if you brought it to a head, where did you get to the place where you were ultimately finding yourself pushed out of the EEOC?
I was the lead investigator of the Madison Square Garden and the New York Knicks in the case of Anua Brown versus Isaiah Thomas in Madison Square Garden. That was Ricardo Jones's investigation. And I was to conduct that investigation of Isaiah Thomas sexually harassing and retaliating against Miss Brown. Now, most people think that Isaiah Thomas was the bad guy in that case, but what I revealed in my investigation, it was not Isaiah Thomas. It was Stephon Marbury. Stephon Marbury was the top basketball star for the New York Knicks. And Stephon Marbury had had his cousin hired by the New York Knicks in basically a no-show job. And what Stephon Marbury and his cousin were doing, they were forcing the cheerleaders of the New York Knicks to have sex with them. If they didn't have sex with them, then they were going to be fired. So they would pass these girls back and forth. Now, I got that information from Ms. Brown's attorney, but Mrs. Brown's attorney did not want to give that information to the EEOC.
Because that would hurt the reputation of the New York Knicks, that they allowed their cheerleaders to be passed around like canapes to certain athletes, or that they would be liable to be sued by all the cheerleaders once they were exposed. Could you, what? Well,
let me elaborate on that. The attorneys for Ms. Brown basically didn't trust the EEOC because all attorneys that do business at the EEOC know that they're on the take and they're corrupt. I mean, this is not a secret. This is a well-known fact. So what they told me was, Ricardo, we just want a right to sue. We don't want an investigation by the EEOC because they know the EEOC is corrupt. And I said, time out. I have never thrown an investigation. I have never taken a bribe, and you know this. I have been working there about 6 years at that time. I said, give me a chance to do a thorough investigation for you. The attorney said, okay, Ricardo, I'm going to give you this information. It's about Stephon Marbury and his cousin. So I said, all right, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to bring Stephon Marbury in there, and I'm going to bring his cousin in there. I'm going to bring every cheerleader that basically was an employee of the New York Knicks and Madison Square Gardens, right, for the last 5 years. And I'm going to interview every single one of them and find out how many of them have been sexually harassed by Stephon Marbury and his cousin, right? And that information got out. But the real tragedy to this whole thing is that once that information got back to my supervisors and managers, they decided that they're going to take Ricardo Jones off that investigation.
Were you removed?
I was removed from that investigation. It was given to a Hispanic female that basically couldn't speak English well with a heavy Hispanic accent, and they conducted the investigation. This was the biggest case of employment discrimination that happened in the New York area in probably the last 10 years.
Did the woman get justice, Ms. Brown get justice?
Not from the EEOC.
Did she ultimately prevail in another court?
She ultimately prevailed in another court. But what should have happened, it should have been a class action that had covered all the female cheerleaders probably for the past 3 to 5 years, and they didn't prevail.
So only one person was able to get some degree of justice without the help of the EEOC.
That's correct. But that only happened because they took Ricardo Jones off the case, because I intended to do a class action. I was going to interview all the cheerleaders who had been possibly sexually harassed by Stephon Marbury and his cousin. Isaiah Thomas basically was a gender discriminator. There's a difference between sexual harassment and gender discrimination.
How was he discriminating?
He said bad things about females. He may have used the B word about females, but he never asked Miss Brown to have sex with him.
So what we have is a person who may be inappropriate in their conduct, but they're not the villain. Now, so I get that. So after you get moved from that case, what's the next episode that brings you to the point where you find yourself no longer working in that job?
Well, after that case, I confronted my supervisor. My supervisor said, you know, Ricardo,
you know your name?
Right. And her name was Rosemary Wilkes. She's a Hispanic female that married a black manager that she worked directly under. You're not supposed to work for your husband.
It's a conflict of interest.
Conflict of interest
again.
again.
There's a possibility they may have met on the job?
Yes, they did. He divorced his African-American wife to marry one of the secretaries in the office, then had her promoted as a supervisor. And then once she was promoted as a supervisor, he almost directly supervised her directly, which is a double conflict of interest.
Did you see any other instances where people picked, they had perhaps an office romance, and all of a sudden the secretary or the intern becomes a fast-rising ingenue within the EEOC?
That's a common practice at the EEOC. That was nothing uncommon about that. Everybody at headquarters knew what was going on between Rosemary Wilkes or Rosemary Perez and Harold Wilkes.
If you had a daughter who had an opportunity to intern at the EEOC, would you, as a father, think that was an opportunity for a young woman?
No, I would not let my daughter intern at the EEOC because of the large number of lesbians that are at the EEOC in managerial positions and in attorney positions.
And males as well, or is it just the women that you find would be the most aggressive?
I think it's both. And as you heard me say, the Assistant General Counsel for the EEOC, James Lee, is a sexual predator. And I only know this information because other females at the EEOC have confirmed that he is a sexual predator.
So you went to your supervisor, who's essentially slept her way, as you said, to her position. You go to her, you don't get resolution to your complaint, so where do you go next?
I was upset. I was very upset. But again, I said, hey, you're my supervisor. I mean, if you guys are going to take this away from me because you know I'm going to do a thorough job, then, I'm not sure what it is that I could do. I already knew the EEOC was corrupt in the first place. So I said, hey, she said, are you going to make a whole lot of noise about this? I said, hey, look, you know what? You the boss. You made this decision. That's it. Now, to make that up to me, what she did was she gave me another case, which was Roy Tarpley versus the NBA and the Dallas Mavericks, which was a way better case to me because it was about disability discrimination for somebody who was a former alcoholic and a former drug addict, and it was. She said, I'm going to give you this one, which is really involving the NBA and the Dallas Mavericks, to make it up to you for the Isaiah Thomas case.
Is it possible that the Knicks were giving money to someone, and that's why they wanted you off, but this other team may not have been paying someone, so they said, well, we're going to enforce cases against people who don't give us anything, and we'll pull off our pit bull investigators. We'll remove them from cases where we're getting some money under the table from them. Is that a fair estimation of what might have been the reason why they didn't have a problem with you getting that other case?
Well, you're getting pretty close to it, but here's the reality here. The key to this thing is guess who represents the Madison Square Garden and the New York Knicks? And I had other investigations against the Madison Square Garden before. You're not going to believe this. It's Proskauer and Rhodes. See, there's a connection here. Proskauer and Rhodes is bribing the EEOC. They're representing the Dallas Mavericks and the Madison Square Garden and the New York Knicks.
And it's a second career place, you're saying. Once I want to leave the EEOC, I can go to that firm and possibly have a shot at being a partner if I play ball the right way.
Well, if you're a vice chair or a commissioner at the EEOC, then you can barter that away fixing cases and become a partner or a lawyer. But you got to understand at that level, it's about the lawyers fixing cases so that they can go to work for one of the top law firms in the country, Proskauer and Rhodes. And that's what Miss Leslie Silverman did. She would call to Nancy Boyd, who had became the deputy director of the EEOC, and just tell her to find something wrong with an investigation, and she would, and then we wouldn't litigate. And basically what they did in the Roy Tarpley case was Silverman called up the vice chair of the EEOC in Washington, D.C., and told Nancy Boyd. Nancy Boyd is the bag person. See, you have a bag person in a corruption and conspiracy.
And a bag person, explain that.
A bag person is the person who goes around and collects money for corrupt people in the federal government or civil service or in local government agencies. They have a bag, and they take it to the people that give the bribe, and they say, put the money in the bag.
And it's a Gucci bag?
it may be a Gucci bag, but how they do it is they have to have one person who actually sees and deals with the bribery, right? And in this case, it was Nancy Boyd, a very fair-haired, blonde, blue-eyed female that everybody liked in Washington, D.C. So she would take the orders from Leslie Silverman, who took the orders from Proskauer and Rose. And to make a long story short, I don't think very many people know that David Stearns, the commissioner of basketball, is a former partner of Proskauer and Rose.
So I want to ask you this question. If these bribes come in, wouldn't it make sense that people have to report this income? Does that mean that the EEOC has a large number of people that should be investigated by the IRS?
There is no investigations of anybody by the EEOC. There is no actual...
So the IRS doesn't... There hasn't been an IRS audit of anyone that's in the EEOC to your knowledge?
No.
But
no.
You would think that that would be one way that corruption could be addressed, because if they followed the money, there's a possibility that people would notice perhaps some of this is different.
But that's if the EEOC was a professional organization and had some ethical rules that had to be followed. There are no ethical rules at the EEOC. There are very few or no professional investigators or any civil rights lawyers. Most of the lawyers at the EEOC did not represent.
And they were fired back in the Bush period. I mentioned it earlier. Most of the civil rights attorneys were let go at certain points. They've gone after, I'm sorry, it's a Civil Rights Commission, but more or less the infrastructure for investigating and fighting for civil rights more or less got gutted within the first Bush term, if I'm correct. In that period, a large number of people got purged out.
I think that was U.S. district attorneys that got purged, not at the EEOC. But how they do it is they shuffle people around from the U.S. Attorney's Office to the EEOC. So there are many ways that these attorneys basically are shuffled around from one agency to another. You can't get to the EEOC unless you know a corrupt attorney at the EEOC. Because see, this whole conspiracy and fraud would be exposed very easily if you brought somebody in off the street. So you have to be vouched for it. In the corrupt criminal world, they call it duking in. Somebody has to duke you in. So that means you have to have somebody who's involved in the conspiracy and the fraud who gives you basically a recommendation that you're not going to expose the conspiracy that's going on. I learned this in the DEA Academy that the United States Army sent. They taught me how to expose conspiracies and frauds and how to expose this type of stuff. But most EEOC investigators go through a one-week course where there isn't even any testing. So if there is no testing, how can you certify people to be investigators at the EEOC? You don't intend to certify them. You just want people to dismiss complaints.
I want to come back to this. If you could succinctly get to the point where you're dismissed.
All right.
Your case,
mm-hmm.
and try to bracket that in.
All
say,
right.
and because my understanding is you have some very, very high value information on the leadership, and I want to make certain that we get that out. So if you do that, perhaps the Honorable Cynthia McKinney will perhaps invite you to come back. But I'd like you to do that. So that case is important. If
okay.
I'm correct, you have
right.
a
right.
possibility of $100 million case
mm-hmm.
that results from that.
Right. Well, the real issue, I honestly thought, I knew about the fraud and corruption, but I thought my skills and my ability was so strong that I can be a salmon swimming upstream of the corruption at the EEOC. And I was doing a good job of it until I started hitting some heavy hitters in the head. I hit Fox News Network in the head at the same time they had the investigation of sexual harassment against Bill O'Reilly. There was another case against them that I did a gender investigation and went to litigation against Rupert Murdoch's direct reports, right, and it was successful. I also hit Delphi University on an equal pay case, and that's again where Mr. Lou Graziano basically fixed or took a bribe from the attorney that represented the Delphi University to keep the damages down in federal court. See, that's where a lot of this stuff goes on. See, it goes on in the consent decree in federal court, and that's why my lawsuit was sealed in federal court, because I made these allegations in my lawsuit. And the judges in federal court did not want to have to go back and reopen up a lot of those consent decrees.
Could you give a few of the jewels?
Let me give you just a few of the jewels there. The case against Morgan Stanley, which was a very large $54 million settlement that seemed like the EEOC had done some great work as far as discrimination, gender discrimination against female stockbrokers at Morgan Stanley. That case had no evidence to substantiate gender discrimination against Morgan Stanley at all. The statistics never beared it out.
So was it a shakedown?
It was a shakedown. Basically, the EEOC sent an attorney to Paris, France, because the statistics didn't pan out against Morgan Stanley. They put an attorney on an airplane and flew him to Paris, France 2 times, right, to get the employees of Morgan Stanley in Europe to join the class action against Morgan Stanley because the statistics didn't bear out. 2 times, right?
And that was one case. Are there any others where that's one jewel?
The worst case that I had was against an employment agency by the name of Atrium Staffing, which was an employment agency that was hired by BET, which was hired by Condé Nast, which was hired by maybe 50 Fortune 50 corporations to discriminate against African Americans and foreign-born blacks. Now, how they did that was they were coding African Americans. They said that African Americans had regional accents. That's a code, not to send them to basically entertainment industry clients, right? And by the way, Ralph Lauren Polo basically continued the discriminatory practices through Atrium Staffing. And they didn't know that I had been involved in the investigation against Ralph Lauren Polo 6 years earlier. And by mistake, I ended up with this investigation that a white female had who had basically undermined the investigation of white females and a white Hispanic male coming forward and admitting that there were coding of African American clients at this employment agency.
Was a bribe involved in that?
You know, in that case, I believe there were some bribes involved in that case. But what happened was once they found out that I had been on a Ralph Lauren Polo investigation, which was a client of Atrium Staffing, they basically fixed that case with somebody at the EEOC, and the complainants were bought off on the side. The law firm that was involved representing the complainant, William Keck, was a law firm in New York City by the name of Littman and Plusser. And somehow or the other, they were bought off, and that investigation, and that case should have involved maybe hundreds, maybe thousands of African Americans that had been coded not to go to these entertainment industry clients, which was BET, David Yurman, Condé Nast, GQ Magazine, Bride Magazine. I mean, David Yurman, Maximus, and BET was one of them also. And most of the young people that went to that employment agency was trying to break into the communications industry and the entertainment industry. But they were only taking blonde-haired, blue-eyed females and getting them internships and part-time jobs and placements at these entertainment industry clients, because they did not want black females or black males in those positions, temporary positions.
And those are 2 of the jewels. And so summarize the case, because they sealed it. Apparently you had something, you had them. Your case was written well enough to nail them.
I had more than that. I had the codes. The payroll manager gave me the codes. The office manager had confirmed
the bank codes, so you could see.
I had the codes off of their database. I mean, and I took that information to Mr. Lou Graziano, the corrupt attorney for the EEOC. He refused to even look at the codes. And at that point, they decided that they would bring me up on investigations because they didn't like my aggressive tactics in getting this information.
You go from a highly revered, respected employee, and all of a sudden you become, pardon my language, the bad nigger on the plantation that needs to be beaten.
Because I would not go along with the bribery and the corruption and the fraud and that's going on at the EEOC.
And so the result is
I became under investigation myself for doing my job more thoroughly than anybody else.
And you get fired?
Not at that time. I was doing another investigation against the New Rochelle School District, who had been under investigation for racial discrimination. They had a Curious George monkey. I'm going to hold up the picture of this, right? hanging on a bulletin board in a middle school in New Rochelle, New York.
Is that a noose?
That's a noose, a white noose around a brown Curious George monkey.
What do you think that represents?
That represents the individual that did that wanted to do some harm to a child of color.
So are you suggesting that the monkey represents a black person?
A black child. It's a black child's toy. So if you put a noose around a black child's toy or brown toy of a child, that means that you want to lynch a child, correct?
Okay. Now, do you think a child did that?
No. The supervisor of custodial workers by the name of Mr. Carino, an Italian individual, hung that noose up on a bulletin board in his office in the middle school for 7 years.
Surely the principal and administrative staff of the school, no one was black there.
Yes, the assistant principal was a highly educated young black African-American female. She had been in that guy's office at least 50 times.
Okay.
I interviewed her and probably 50 other people.
So was she a mother?
She was not a mother.
But so you have a vice principal of the school, a black woman educator, who does not notice and I see there's another noose there, so there's several nooses.
Well, what happened was the blacks in that school basically had caved in and accepted the fact that this individual could do this without impunity and nothing could happen to him.
He's a custodian.
He was the supervisor of custodial workers at the middle school.
Okay, so a custodian has so much influence that they can have an openly racist manifestation of their hatred for young black people, and he had no reason to fear.
No, he had been doing this for years, and he had hanging up there for 7 years, so he didn't fear. I asked the assistant principal, in which I was very concerned from the beginning of this investigation being given to me, was there anybody concerned for the safety of these children? And I told the lawyer for the New Rochelle School District, no, but I made it clear to the lawyer for the New Rochelle School District that I'm concerned for the safety of these children, and I don't want any of these children harmed because of this incident.
Do you think a swastika could have hung on his wall?
No, the superintendent of the school was Jewish. He wouldn't allow a swastika to go on this long.
Do you think a homosexual slur would be allowed to be on his bulletin board?
No. It was all right to do this to African Americans and kids of color. It was all right to harm them. And it wasn't just by the school district. It was by the district director of the EEOC. Didn't care either. His name was Spencer Lewis, and he's a 30-year veteran attorney of the EEOC. He is now the district director in the Philadelphia office of the EEOC. And he had told some of his white managers that, basically, I'm not concerned for the safety of those children.
Is Spencer an African American?
Yes, he is an African American.
And he's in Philadelphia.
And he's in Philadelphia. He's been removed from New York. He had been a district director in New York City for over 20 years. Most of the people in the New York district area know Spencer Lewis. But Spencer Lewis is an individual that basically believes in the things that Clarence Thomas believes in. When I came into the office, he was very happy in dismissing all complaints of African Americans. You wanted to get on Spencer Lewis's good side, dismiss cases against African Americans, and he'll really like you a lot. He did not like me.
So you have this case, and so this is a case that brings it to a head that you need to be pushed out of the door.
Spencer Lewis, the district director in the New York district office, has a relationship with most of the lawyers that represent the corrupt employers and city agencies in New York. So he had been fixing things for a long time with Mr. Lou Graziano and others at the EEOC to discriminate against African Americans.
So you're alleging, was he the Judas that put the dagger in your back?
He never did like me because I would give a fair professional investigation to African American complaints, and that's what he always had against me.
Would he ever call you militant or anti-white?
He said things. He said things about me that I'd heard through other people.
Can you give me an example of the hearsay?
He just didn't like the way that I conducted myself, and that was the rumors that I had gotten through management and my fellow employees. But the tragedy here is the assistant superintendent of New Rochelle School District is Dr. Frank Smith. He was an African-American brother with a PhD from Howard University. His father was a lawyer on the case tried by Thurgood Marshall Brown versus the Board of Education. His father was a lawyer there. they had put his name on the investigation internally done by the New Rochelle School District. Mr. Frank Smith admitted to me that he had not conducted the investigation and he had not signed the report. So they had forged his name on the report to make it look like a black assistant superintendent had done the investigation internally.
But he wouldn't speak up because he wanted to stay in good graces and retain employment. Is that something that you're asserting?
I'm asserting that he promised to give me an affidavit that he did not conduct an investigation and there were other problems in the New Rochelle District.
Did he deliver his affidavit?
No, he did not. But immediately after he returned from his honeymoon in Jamaica, West Indies, he was promoted to superintendent of the next school district, which is the Sleepy Hollow School District in New York. So his reward for not coming forward with the evidence that this was going on and black children or children of color could have been harmed was that he was now made the superintendent of the next school district to the New Rochelle School District to keep his mouth shut.
Did you meet any other African Americans that had character like you had, or did you find, you mentioned salmon swimming upstream, that's yours, but did you see people who just actively, I would say, shuffle or basically do whatever they felt was expected of them to go along to get along with an unfair environment?
This practice had been going on in New York as long as Spencer Lewis had been there, and Mr. James Lee, the Assistant General Counsel for the EEOC, had worked in New York also.
Now, just summarize your case. You filed a case for $100 million. If you could tell in a minute what that is, because I still want to get your commentary on leadership. Mm-hmm. You filed a $100 million case when?
What are you talking about? My lawsuit?
Your lawsuit.
I filed a lawsuit, right, eventually after I followed all the complaint procedures that are available to government employees, and all of them were corrupt. I filed a grievance, and they didn't give me any union representation. I went to the Federal Labor Relations Board because I wasn't afforded any union protection in my grievances, and the Federal Labor Relations Agency basically denied me any protection whatsoever, and that was an appointee by Barack Obama is in charge of the Federal Labor Administration, right? I also went to the MSPB, the Merit System Protection Board. The federal law judge that was assigned that case, the EEOC first denied me a within grade to get back at me because I wouldn't go along with these practices.
So you were denied income because you would not
go along with the bribery and the corruption at the EEOC, but they did it the wrong way. But the judge that, I think his name is Judge Booker, basically told the EEOC that they did not deny me my within grade the correct way, and he was telling them how to deny me the right way. He told me I should go back and get a bad evaluation. I had already received a 2-year evaluation that said I was satisfactory. He told me to go back and take another 90-day evaluation by the same racist bigot supervisor that I had been put up under to basically get me out of the EEOC, and her name is Electra York, a known racist bigot from Washington, D.C., who had to leave the EEOC in the 70s because of her racist bigoted practices. And also she was rehired by Nancy Boyd in New York. Everybody knows she's a racist bigot. When they want to get rid of a black person, they put you under Electra York. She is now an enforcement manager in the New York District Office of the EEOC.
Judge, jury, and executor of blacks for the EEOC.
Right. They had a special lady, a special white racist female bigot that they use to get rid of black people who won't toe the line at the EEOC.
You get to court with your case, with all of your information, and you're requesting $100 million and compensation for damages and whatever. You also include in your claim at least 20 former co-workers. And what happens to your case?
They were managers, former managers and stuff. You got to understand that everything is fixed in New York. New York is the mecca for corruption at the EEOC and the federal government and the federal court. Basically, they assigned a judge to my case in federal court in the Southern District that was the former general counsel for the city of New York. Now, how can the former general counsel for the city of New York now be a sitting judge in the same district that he was representing the city of New York in? I knew my case was doomed at that point. So,
and what happened?
They sealed my lawsuit because the information that I'm giving you now was in my lawsuit.
So you haven't been able to move forward with that yet?
Well, I did move forward as far as I could, but basically there was a snowstorm in New York. My lawsuit was 4 days late in being submitted, and they used that as a reason to dismiss my lawsuit.
I want to do this because I believe we're going to have you come back. You wanted to share with our audience your thoughts on the African American leadership that has not, at least in your estimation, served. Perhaps you will name a few names. You have a few minutes.
Quickly, I'm going to point out some of the flaws in this current administration. Ms. Jacqueline Barnes is a former attorney for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. She went to law school with Ms. Michelle Obama. She got the position because she's a friend of Michelle Obama, the First Lady of the United States. She also went to undergraduate college with a very corrupt U.S. Representative by the name of Yvette Clarke. She went to Oberlin College with Yvette Clarke. I gave this information I'm giving you to Yvette Clarke in 2008.
She's a member of Congress?
She's a member of Congress. She's the minority whip for the Congressional Black Caucus. Her name is Yvette Clarke from the 11th District in Brooklyn. I did not know that she had went to undergraduate college with Jacqueline Barnes. Jacqueline Barnes fired me. I gave the same information to Jacqueline Barnes before she fired me. I thought that Barack Obama and his appointees were going to be righteous, but they are not righteous. They are really against black people, and they came in with a vengeance to get rid of RICARDO Jones because they intended to dismiss more complaints than the Bush administration.
Is it true that Clarence Thomas has a relative working for the EEOC?
I don't know if Clarence Thomas has a relative working for the EEOC, but I know Miss Yvette Clarke had a relative that was a lawyer and an administrative judge at the EEOC, and she was forced out. So to say that Representative Yvette Clarke had no knowledge of the corruption going at the EEOC, I gave it to her, and her cousin was an attorney that had been forced out of the EEOC.
Are there any other persons that you can identify that are EEOC persons, or at least in the Washington area?
Well, they said that I had information that Naomi Earp Campbell had had cases fixed for former law school friends while she was the commissioner at the EEOC.
And there's no one else in the Congressional Black Caucus that you're aware of? You had mentioned there were other caucus persons. You've said all of them?
Well, I did hear that Ms. Maxine Waters said that the EEOC is dismissing the African-American complaints because lack of budget, which is a blatant lie. She's just covering up for the EEOC. So, in my opinion, I think that most of the congressional members do know about the corruption at the EEOC. There's another lady by the name of Barbara McCloskey. She has firsthand information. She's a senator at the on the Oversight Committee, and I've given her that information, and she knows about the corruption and is involved in the corruption.
The congressional representative for Washington, D.C. is Eleanor Holmes Norton. She worked with the EEOC. She carries a very high reputation in the area. Do you have the same impression of my congresswoman?
Yes, I do. I have gotten information after a lawsuit filed by a gentleman by the name of Sam Wright Jr. that Eleanor Holmes Norton did more damage to the EEOC than Clarence Thomas did. And I know many people have very high regards for Eleanor Holmes Norton, but she was the former commissioner of the New York City Commission on Human Rights who brought Miss Lecter York, a known bigot, down to the EEOC to clear out the black employees of the EEOC in Washington, D.C. So Ms. Holmes Norton came from New York with a vengeance to get rid of black employees at the EEOC so she could bring in her white corrupt friends to undermine the progress on civil rights for black people at the EEOC. So many people do not understand that Eleanor Holmes Norton is against civil rights for black people.
As a Washingtonian, we will certainly hope that your report is not correct, but we thank you for your information. On behalf of Education for Peace, on behalf of Dignity, this is the Dignity Report. Our guest is certainly the charismatic, articulate, and prurient Mr. RICARDO Jones, Sr. We thank you. God bless you. Stand up. Get up, stand up for your rights.
Thank you very much.